One of the things that we need in facing the challenges of climate change is more knowledge, more understanding, and the opportunity to think calmly about the issues rather than just to those who have the loudest voices, perhaps. It's one thing to try and understand the atmosphere, but we need in this debate to understand the land as well. And part of the purpose of today is trying to bring those subjects together in the context of this landscape, the Blackdown Hills, and how the huge global issues of climate change actually manifest themselves for us, and how that affects us and our plans and our aspirations and the things that we can do.
So we're all aware that the world is getting warmer, but the global average temperature, although it's what we use to sort of measure climate change, it doesn't really mean anything to us on the ground. What we're more concerned with is local high temperatures, local cold temperatures, local drought, for example, and we need to know, are we going to get more frequent drought or less frequent drought? And local flooding, of course, as well. And as we're well aware, in the north of the country at the moment, there's some terrible flooding happening, affecting lots of people, both in urban and rural areas. So the question is, how is the weather changing and going to change further as part of climate change? To meet the Paris Agreement targets of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, we not only need to stop emitting carbon to the atmosphere, we need to take it back out again. And you can only really do that with the land. But it's not yet known to what extent this is possible, to use the land for taking up carbon and keeping up food production, and where the compromises will need to be made. So it's a really important area to look at, both scientifically, but also with people and communities and what works for them. What this chart is showing is what would happen if we continue to burn fossil fuels and deforest and to continue to increase CO2 in the atmosphere. That puts us on track for emissions that would take us to global warming of somewhere between 2.5 and 4.5 degrees by the end of the century. So a 3-degree or 4-degree world is very much on the horizon, unless we rein in our emissions as a global community quite substantially and quite urgently.
After the Paris climate agreements, there was in 2015, the NFU saw a bit of an opportunity to try and promote net zero agriculture in this country. But what we decided was to do it a bit quicker. So we came in with net zero agriculture by 2040. And Minette Batters, our president, launched this idea back in January this year at the Oxford Farming Conference. And then in September, we launched our own plan of how we were actually going to do this. What we were looking at is farmers to be part of the solution. So we've recognised there's a problem and we want to get ahead of the game. So we want to be able to say that this is how we can help reduce those carbon emissions within agriculture. But what we're asking for is farmers to get on to the aspiration of this, but not to give up on their current livestock farming or their dairy farming or cereals. Not to change their farming practices, but just adapt what they're doing to improve on whatever carbon they're using. So the NFU's published the Achieving Net Zero Ambitions Guidance Pack. It's available online, and you can also phone up the office or call NFU's Call First and find out more information about that. We're also looking at working with essential stakeholders and key groups to help achieve our ambitions. And we're looking at external data as to where exactly we can start to improve with teaming up with the Committee for Climate Change and the Royal Society.
We are all carbon sequesters. We're doing it already. Farming is already doing that. We need to get that message across. Farming practices are getting carbon back into the soil. We are part of the solution.
point I was trying to make was that although carbon, CO2, methane has been a lot of the news of late, reality is if we get our farming systems right, we can deal with it, and we benefit by better soils, so we better crops anyway, and so we can mitigate a lot of the short-term issues, things like short-term soil erosions and the like, just by getting our soil better. But we're also, in the same time, improving the situation regarding global warming, carbon sequestration, and we can be part of the solution to the whole question.
As farmers, we can actually find out what we're doing. We can't just sit in our box and say, we're farmers, we're brilliant. Actually, some of us aren't. We all get problems with our systems. Go to Farm Carbon Toolkit is one of a very good. It's based out of the southwest. It's a really, really good website to look at. You can actually work out your own farm carbon toolkit by looking back through some past records, and it's adaptable and changeable as you move on. So I decided to do my own. I sold my farm a few years ago, but I went back to the year before I sold up. So my farm carbon balance was, this is a carbon sequestration from a 145 hectare organic beef, suckler and arable farm selling cattle, wheat and beans. And I basically was sequestering a tonne of carbon per hectare. And that was on the basis that I had holiday cottages, I had my mother's cottage, and my own farmhouse, which also had an awful lot of heating on it. I put everything into this to work out how bad I was, because I took my own farmhouse into account as well. So the heating oil is a negative as far as our carbon toolkit. My car, my wife's car, my daughter's car, they all use diesel or petrol. So they all had to be taken into account. So on a good farming system, I thought it was a good farming system, I feel it was a good farming system, I was increasing the soil carbon by doing it, including my hedges, my trees and everything. Good way of finding out exactly where you're at.
So part of what I covered in my presentation was the local aspects of climate change in the UK, and here specifically in the Blackdown Hills area, what kind of changes we're seeing already and what we could expect to see in the future. We can expect to see winters getting wetter. We can expect to see probably summers getting drier, but that's harder to pin down. So we could see as much as 70% reductions in summer rainfall, for example, in the most extreme scenario, but perhaps a 30% or 40% increase in winter rainfall. But there's large uncertainties in these numbers, but also importantly, even in the dry summer scenario, when it rains, we're expected to rain more heavily, more intense rainfall, because a warmer world means more intense downpours. So combinations of water stress, water scarcity, but also flooding are in the pipeline.
In the West Country, we have this big switch in September to October. And for me, it's the untold story, really. The fact that come the back end of September, after the equinox, it's going to rain. And it's going to rain a lot in the West Country. And it's going to rain a lot more. And so this just puts the pressure on farming and the systems big time. And particularly now, and we've got it this time, this year, when that is a massive switch, where there's just no windows to do anything. So I have agriculturist by training, soil scientist by training. I understand the plight of farmers when you've bought crops, got winter crops, they've got to go in, and you've got advisors saying, get crop cover in, crop cover, we need crop cover, don't till, and the temptation and the commercial pressure to force the ground is huge. And this is what's happening. And then you force the ground, it goes down tight, and then it rains heavily, and we blame the weather, and then I turn up. And it's too late, unfortunately. And I've looked at now 4,000 sites, published it, and 40% of those sites that I've looked at are compacted, causing runoff problems. So that's a lot of land. And as a result, it's causing all this externality. And I think it's down to management, but I totally understand the farming industry and why we're here. And so what I'm trying to get across is that we have a rainfall problem, but we also have a soils problem, and the two are overlapping.
The best way to assess soil compaction is with the eye, visual assessment, and it's not rocket science. And it's also knowing the soil type. So if you're on back to the clay cap, say in the Blackdowns, now at depth the soil will be compacted quite naturally. It's clay. And now you either live with that or you do something about it. And traditionally, to do something about it, you drain it and have a ditch. But you might not have a ditch to drain it, because if you were to loosen that clay at depth, you might make it worse because the water can't drain away. And so you've destabilised the whole thing. Modern farming practices can exacerbate soil compaction, but it's mainly about the management, not necessarily certain crops or certain practices, but more about how things are done that causes compaction. And the thing I wanted to zoom in on in particular was soil moisture and timing, and how if the soil is too wet, and you work the ground, doesn't matter what you do, whether it's grass or any crop or crops, that if the ground is wet, you will cause compaction. And so these simple things are making all the difference.
There's a whole range of options that are on the table for farmers, and when I see people, there's really interested buzz about what they can do. And of course all of this is really important when we look at things like climate change, but even the more immediate impacts of climate change, such as flooding, which is a very real problem, especially locally. So the UK government has committed to planting 11 million trees by 2022. This figure varies quite a lot, because sometimes it's we're going to plant X amount of trees within the lifetime of this Parliament. Well, Parliament seems to be quite short these days, so so these are really the rough figures that you'll hear bandied around. But importantly then, for a carbon neutral UK, it's been estimated that we need to plant 30,000 hectares of new woodland annually up to 2050. But really our tree planting rates are really only 13,000 hectares. So the point is really that we're under half of the tree planting that really we need to do. All right, so we need more trees. So in conclusion, planting trees, particularly the right trees, in the right places can help with both climate adaptation and mitigation. It can help to alleviate flooding. It can bring biodiversity benefits and also help to engage communities.
Those things might be, what might be win-wins and what might be.
Reduce your carbon footprint.
Are you carbon neutral?
Better educated, better informed.
For example, sources of information that we've talked about.
Yeah. I think there's always going to be that balance between the two.
Anybody whose agreement comes up for renewal now has been told you can run on another year.
Why do we always have to incentivise farmers with subsidy? I mean, this is another big question, but
the economics of it rule everything at the end of the day. Yeah. And I agree with you.
Having said that, when we came to actually put our 3 points down, we are talking about understanding the science, but we did move into what can we actually do about and how can we, really make this a local thing. So we identified things like, trying to have information available that's kind of valid and robust is the first kind of thing, really. And as I said, we had those few websites we were talking about. So making that kind of available to local groups within like the Blackdown Hills, and that would be kind of in the form of parish councils, women's institutes, the NFU and NGOs as well. So we're all kind of singing from the same sheet, so to speak. Finally, really, that this isn't kind of the end of the process, so to speak, that we would have further kind of work groups and maybe subgroups within this group that could actually then discuss this kind of further.
Where we basically just listed out all the issues we thought around livestock and climate in the future, and then tried to come up with some ideas to address those issues, and pulled out the 3 which we thought we could actually do something about in the Facilitation Fund. So those 3 were one about carbon footprint calculation that was mentioned this morning, and how maybe the Facilitation Fund could use that as a tool with some willing farmers to look at measuring the carbon footprint of the farms and working out how then that advice can be used, that information could be used as advice to improve farm practices. The second one was around understanding and wanting more to know about regenerative farming. It seems to be an increasing idea and practice, and there's lots of innovations happening around regenerative farming, and we all know about it, but we didn't really know what it is, and we want to know more about it. So there's some training and maybe some visits on people that are deploying that. And the last one was, if we're going to move from farming cows to farming carbon credit codes and farming credits, we want to know what they are, how to do it, who do we sell them to, how does that market work, how do we buy into it, and what will they pay? And we don't know anything about that at the moment. It just seems to be a very opaque concept. So if the Facilitation Fund could provide some clarity on that, that'd be good.
The well-being of the ecosystem, of which we are a large part.
Essentially, we came to the conclusion they're very complex soils, and it's going to be difficult. And my segue back in from what Chris was saying is the difficulty of understanding that mechanism of assessing our soils and everything else is going to be the key to all of this. What was quite interesting is we went through various parts of our conversation, and the lady in front mentioned the concept of biomimicry, and through the biomimicry we started then talking about how that essentially is what a lot of people's understanding of mob grazing is all about. So in that respect we then came up with the 3 points based on the concept of mob grazing as well. But we would fundamentally, everything came down to having a simple measurement that the farming community could buy into, understand, and then be able to be judged against, so that could then be its particular value. There was a distinct lack of guidance and mentoring within the system to help people get from wherever they are now to wherever we need them to be, or whether they're already there and they're maintaining, if they're in the best position that their ground and land can sustain. But then the point that was come up at the very end was the farmers are the solution to a lot of these issues that can help the general public. So the public money for public good fits quite nicely with that. And instead of being perceived, as was pointed out earlier, doors of 11% of the problem, being perceived as 25% of the solution.
For a reason, so it's always a case of...
I think a lot of the speakers, I think pretty much all of them this morning, talked about issues with flooding, drought, rainfall acceptance with soils, and the corresponding kind of impacts on water quality and things as well. So so water being a very important element to climate change. In terms of some of the solutions, we talked about education and engagement being really, really important, and that actually, some of the people in this room might not be the biggest offenders in a way, or the kind of the people that are causing some of these issues in our catchments. So how do we try to engage them and work with them at a catchment scale or a local scale on these issues? And part of a sort of approach that we talked about doing, firstly within the Connecting the Gone project, but also about how we could link that up with other catchments as well, is about building a shared understanding of the catchment, the ecosystem services that we're getting from the catchment in terms of food production, in terms of the other services that we get, and how we need to capture the externalities from one thing like growing maize for biodigesters, and the impact that might have on water quality and ecology.
The immediate division was between conservation and commercial, and one or two people felt that you could do both. Some people felt that that was definitely a no-no. There are your very individual methods of management which you alone, once you've got to a woodland, will obviously develop. The second issue, which then came leaping to the fore, was the matter of ash dieback. How to find advice and so on and so forth, and that was whistled around the circuit. And what to replace it with. Discussions over sycamore were there. People don't like sycamore, but there are other alternatives which were put forward. And then someone raised the dreaded issue of climate change, which is why we were here, and whether we should be considering species, presumably therefore from further south, which might find themselves climatically suited in 50 years' time. And all this left us wondering, where do we get more information? Which brought us to topic number 3, which was we need a hub. We need a pub somewhere where we can go and meet, where we can talk to other woodland stewards and share our knowledge and experience. I should say, share your knowledge and experience. It is deep and profound, and you really must. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
I think listening to the feedback from the groups, I mean, the common thread very clearly was information and communication, access to good quality information, unbiased insofar as it can be unbiased information. And with any human challenge, we need to be able to feed our knowledge base, our collective knowledge base, if we are to take action. We need to learn more, we need to share more, and we need to be able to actually feel more the consequences of what is happening.
Let's look at what we can do within our local environment, and let's concentrate on our own strengths. There isn't a one-size-fits-all way of farming, and every area has its own specific best practices, but we maybe need to remember to go back to them occasionally by looking at perhaps some of the breeds we use, perhaps crops we grow, the grass crops that we plant, and the way we manage them.
The first thing I want them to do when they go home is to download the NFU's Achieving Net Zero guidance pack. If they do that, they can read through everything I've spoken about today, and it'll help set out our roadmap and how we can see us being able to achieve our ambitions.
What I'm really hoping for is that people feel so enthused they might even set up their own tree planting group for the Blackdown Hills, which would really be a result. But I think then people are really starting to think about the issues, starting to think about what they can do. Maybe they've got some existing woodlands, they're wondering how to best manage it, or maybe not to manage it for more resilience to climate change. Maybe talking about locally grown timber so we have more timber in construction. Can some of that at least be locally grown here in the Blackdown Hills?
I would first of all say think positively, and absolutely do not come away from this meeting with a fear of despair and hopelessness. It's very easy to come out of climate change discussions fearing the future. But yes, we have to be resilient and be prepared for that, but also there's opportunities here. We probably do have to do some things differently. It's worth thinking very carefully though, and don't think in simplistic terms. Often very simple, supposed solutions are put forward. It's not always as simple as that. Just look intelligently at what you do and how it fits in, and make some good, well-informed choices.